Let me tell you something that most people will never understand about power. Real power, the kind that bends nations, breaks regimes, and reshapes the course of history, doesn't announce itself with a press conference. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for consensus. Real power moves quietly, deliberately, and with absolute precision. And then, when the moment arrives, it strikes with such force that the enemy has no choice but to reckon with what they were never prepared to face. What you are about to hear is not a news story. It is a case study in strategic dominance, in the application of pressure so precise and so relentless that even the most defiant regime on earth is now sitting at a negotiating table it swore it would never approach. What you are about to witness is what happens when America stops apologizing and starts operating. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next few minutes will change how you see American power, foreign policy, and the true cost of weakness forever. I want you to think about a choke point, not a metaphor, a real physical geographical choke point. A narrow body of water, barely 21 miles wide at its most constricted passage, the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's oil flows through that waterway. 20%. That means every car that drives in Europe, every factory that runs in Asia, every ship that sails across the Pacific is in some direct and measurable way dependent on what happens in those 21 miles of water. For decades, the Iranian regime understood this. They used it. They weaponized it. They made threats. They rattled sabers. They deployed fast attack boats. They planted mines. They harassed commercial shipping. And for years, the world held its breath every time Tehran decided to turn up the temperature. They believed that control of that waterway was their ultimate insurance policy, their ultimate trump card, the one lever they could always pull to bring the West to its knees. What they never counted on was an American president who would flip that leverage entirely on its head. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about how superpowers wage war without firing a single nuclear weapon. I spent 37 years in the United States Navy. I led men and women into the darkest corners of this world. I planned operations that existed in the shadows, missions where failure meant not just death, but geopolitical catastrophe. And in all of those years, I learned one immutable truth about conflict. The side that controls the environment controls the outcome. You don't win by reacting. You win by shaping the battlefield before the enemy even knows the fight has begun. What the United States military did in the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman was not a reaction. It was not a response. It was the execution of a deliberate, carefully constructed strategy designed to strip Iran of every option except two: sign or suffer. And when you understand how that was done, you will understand something fundamental about American military power that the media will never explain to you in a 30-second headline. Let's go back to the beginning of this sequence, because none of what's happening today makes sense without understanding the architecture of what was built before it. For years, Iran operated under a simple assumption that they could outlast American political will. They had watched administrations come and go. They had watched sanctions get imposed, then relax. They had watched red lines get drawn, then erased. They had developed a playbook: delay, deceive, divide, and wait. And it worked. For years, it worked beautifully. Every time pressure mounted, they would offer just enough engagement to buy time, just enough diplomatic ambiguity to fracture Western unity, just enough apparent cooperation to give moderate voices in Washington a reason to argue for patience. They were masters of the long game, and they believed, genuinely believed, that this American president would be no different. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. And the moment they realized it, it was already too late. Here is what happened. The United States didn't just deploy more ships. The United States deployed a blockade, a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, an act of strategic aggression so bold, so historically significant, that it forced every nation on earth to choose a side. Think about what a naval blockade means. This is not a sanction. This is not a strongly worded letter from the United Nations. A naval blockade is a declaration that one nation has the will and the capability to physically prevent another nation from accessing the global economy. It says your oil stays in your tanks, your ships stay in your ports, your revenue dries up, your people feel it, your government bleeds. And if you try to break through, you will be stopped. Not warned, not sanctioned, stopped. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group positioned itself in the region. FA-18 Super Hornets loaded and ready, 20-millimeter Gatling guns charged. And when an Iranian flag tanker attempted to breach that blockade, it was warned multiple times. And when it kept moving, the Super Hornet fired. Not a warning shot into the sea, rounds into the vessel. Clear, unambiguous, kinetic communication. The message was received, and the world watched. And what comes next will reveal just how deeply that moment shook the foundations of the Iranian regime, and why the tremors are still being felt in the streets of Tehran right now. Because here is what the headlines miss. They talk about diplomacy. They talk about proposals and memorandums and negotiating tables. But they don't tell you what's happening inside Iran. They don't tell you about the tens of thousands of Iranians who took to the streets earlier this year in multiple cities simultaneously to protest the economic devastation that decades of regime mismanagement and international isolation have caused. They don't tell you that when those protesters marched, they were met with live ammunition. Not tear gas, not rubber bullets, live rounds. Because that is the nature of a regime that knows it is losing. A government that is confident in its legitimacy does not shoot its own people for walking in the streets. A regime that fires on its citizens is a regime that is afraid. And now, with the naval blockade tightening around their oil exports like a vice, the Iranian government is not just afraid of its own people. It is afraid of running out of time. Because the one thing that has kept this regime afloat, the one economic lifeline that has allowed them to fund their proxies, their nuclear program, their Revolutionary Guard, their domestic suppression apparatus, is oil revenue. And the United States just turned off the tap. I want you to understand what that means at a human level, because strategy without human context is just geometry. Iran is a nation of nearly 90 million people. It is a nation with a young population, over 60% under the age of 30, a population that is educated, that is connected, that is watching the rest of the world through their smartphones and wondering why their currency is worthless and their future is being mortgaged by a theocracy that cares more about regional dominance than about feeding its own citizens. These are people who want what every human being wants: dignity, opportunity, a future worth living. And every day that the blockade holds, every day that oil tankers sit idle and revenue fails to materialize, that frustration grows. It compounds. It reaches a boiling point, and the regime knows it. A senior Israeli official, a man with deep intelligence contacts inside Iran, told reporters that the naval blockade is getting exponentially worse for the regime, and that domestic pressure is rising exponentially. That is not the language of a slow decline. That is the language of a system approaching a breaking point. And if you think the pressure stops there, you are not ready for what's coming next. Because this is where the strategic picture becomes truly extraordinary. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an Iranian problem. It is a global problem. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows through that waterway, and the countries most dependent on that flow are not the United States. America sources only a small fraction of its oil consumption from that region. The countries most exposed are China and America's European allies. China, which has built its entire industrial economy on the assumption of cheap, accessible energy, is facing serious disruptions. Supply chains are straining, energy costs are rising, and Beijing, which has carefully cultivated a relationship with Tehran as a counterbalance to American influence, now finds itself caught in an impossible position. On one hand, they cannot openly support a regime that is defying a U.S. naval blockade without risking their relationship with Washington at a moment when trade negotiations are already extraordinarily fraught. On the other hand, they cannot afford to simply watch their energy supply get strangled. And so the United States, almost as a deliberate act of strategic generosity, is framing this blockade not as an act of aggression against the global order, but as an act of stewardship for it. President Trump has called on other nations to join in ensuring the security of this critical waterway. In other words, America is holding the door open, and it is asking the world to choose stability under American leadership or chaos under Iranian defiance. And into this environment, this extraordinary convergence of military pressure, economic strangulation, domestic unrest, and diplomatic maneuvering, the United States has introduced a proposal, not a vague outline, not a framework for future discussions, a specific, detailed 14-point memorandum, the architecture of a deal that would, if accepted, fundamentally and permanently alter Iran's nuclear trajectory. The Wall Street Journal has reported the key elements. Iran must hand over all enriched material. There will be a 20-year ban on uranium enrichment within Iranian territory. Iran must formally declare that it does not seek nuclear weapons. Key nuclear facilities must be dismantled. International inspections will be triggered by any evidence of violations. Underground nuclear work, the kind that happens in hardened facilities designed to survive airstrikes, is banned entirely. Read that list again, slowly, because what you are looking at is not a negotiating opening position. This is a demand for total nuclear disarmament of a regime that has spent 40 years claiming its nuclear program is its sovereign right and its ultimate guarantee of survival. And the fact that Iran is, at this moment, actually examining this proposal rather than immediately rejecting it tells you everything you need to know about the effectiveness of the strategy that brought them to this point. But don't misread what's happening, because the next chapter of this story is where everything either holds together or falls apart. And what comes next will demand something from American leadership that is rarer than military power, rarer than economic leverage, and rarer than political will. It will demand patience without weakness, resolve without recklessness, and the wisdom to know the difference between a regime that is negotiating in good faith and one that is buying time for a countermove it has not yet revealed. Stay with me, because part two is where the stakes get highest, where the decisions made in the next 48 hours will echo for the next 40 years. There is a concept in special operations that we call decision dominance. It means that you move through the decision cycle of your enemy so fast, so relentlessly, so unpredictably, that by the time they have decided how to respond to your last move, you have already made three more. Decision dominance is not about brute force. It is not about having the biggest weapon or the loudest voice. It is about tempo. It is about maintaining such a relentless operational rhythm that your opponent is always reacting, always catching up, always off balance, never able to plant their feet, read the battlefield, and execute a coherent counter strategy. What the United States has done to Iran over the past several weeks is a textbook example of decision dominance applied at the geopolitical level. And understanding that framework is the key to understanding why Iran, a regime that has survived revolutions, wars, assassinations, and 4 decades of sanctions, is now sitting across a metaphorical table from American negotiators, examining a 14-point memorandum that would have been politically unthinkable for them to even acknowledge just 6 months ago. This is not luck. This is not accident. This is the product of deliberate, disciplined, strategic execution. And the lessons it contains are not just for presidents and generals. They are for every leader, in every organization, in every domain, who has ever faced an adversary that believes time is on their side. Let me take you back to something that was mentioned almost in passing in the news coverage, but that deserves far more attention than it received. Operation Freedom. You heard the name. You heard that it was put in place on Monday, that it was reportedly working, and that the president ultimately pulled it back. And a reporter asked the right question. Did it work? Was it effective? And the answer from regional officials was unambiguous. Yes, it was working. And here is why that matters. The President of the United States deployed a specific operation, watched it achieve its intended effect, and then, rather than doubling down or riding the momentum, deliberately chose to pull it back. Why? Because in strategic competition at the highest level, a card that has been played is a card that has been spent. But a card that has been demonstrated and then withdrawn, that card becomes something far more powerful. It becomes a threat. It becomes a shadow over every negotiation, every conversation, every decision the Iranian regime makes going forward. They know what Operation Freedom can do. They felt it. And now they have to operate under the permanent uncertainty of not knowing when or whether it might be redeployed. That psychological weight is not a small thing. In the world of high-stakes negotiation, uncertainty is a weapon. And the president just demonstrated that he is willing to wield it with precision. Now I want to talk about Israel, because no analysis of this situation is complete without understanding the role that America's closest ally in the Middle East is playing in this extraordinary strategic moment. While American naval forces were enforcing the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz and Gulf of Oman, Israeli forces were conducting their own operations, launching fresh strikes against Hezbollah in Beirut overnight. Think about what Hezbollah represents in the architecture of Iranian regional power. For decades, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has funded, trained, armed, and directed Hezbollah as its most capable and most dangerous proxy force. Hezbollah is not a terrorist organization in the conventional sense. It is a state within a state, a military force embedded within Lebanese society, possessing precision-guided munitions, anti-ship missiles, and a command and control infrastructure that rivals the standing armies of many nations. It is Iran's forward-deployed deterrent. It is the sword Tehran holds over Israel's head every time the two nations approach the edge of open conflict. And Israel, with full coordination with the United States, is systematically degrading that sword, strike by strike, night by night. And what comes next in that campaign will determine whether Iran enters any final agreement with its regional power projection capability still intact, or whether it arrives at the negotiating table already disarmed of its most dangerous non-nuclear weapon. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu made something very clear in his public statements. He is in contact with President Trump almost daily. His people and the president's people are in constant communication. There are no surprises between them. Read that carefully. There are no surprises. In a region defined by miscalculation, by mixed signals, by the fog of competing interests and contradictory intelligence assessments, the United States and Israel have achieved something remarkable, genuine, real-time strategic synchronization. Every Israeli airstrike on Hezbollah positions in Beirut is not an independent action. It is a coordinated piece of a larger operational picture. Every American naval intercept in the Gulf of Oman is not a standalone event. It is a chapter in a longer story being written by two allies who have decided together that this is the moment to fundamentally reshape the strategic landscape of the Middle East. And Iran, watching from Tehran, watching its proxy get hammered from the air, while its oil exports get strangled at sea, while its people grow angrier by the day, while American bombers sit ready to resume their campaign against nuclear facilities, is running out of moves. But do not mistake a cornered adversary for a defeated one, because the most dangerous moment in any military operation is not when the enemy is strong. It is when the enemy is desperate. And that is precisely where we are right now. I have seen desperation in the field. I have watched men make decisions under pressure that they would never make in a moment of clarity. Decisions driven not by strategy, but by the primal human instinct to do something, anything, to change the conditions that are crushing them. Regimes are not so different from men in that regard. The Iranian leadership is under pressure from every direction simultaneously. Economically, the naval blockade is bleeding their oil revenue, the lifeblood of their domestic programs, their military funding, their capacity to maintain the patronage networks that keep the regime's internal coalition intact. Militarily, their most capable proxy is absorbing strike after strike from one of the most sophisticated air forces in the world. Politically, their own population, the people they claim to govern in the name of God and revolution, are taking to the streets in numbers that required live ammunition to suppress. And diplomatically, the one relationship they believe they could rely on as a counterbalance to American pressure, their partnership with China, is now complicated by Beijing's own desperate need for the oil that flows through the very strait the Americans are blockading. Every exit is narrowing. Every option is shrinking. And into that narrowing corridor, the United States has placed a 14-point proposal and said, this is the door. Choose it or face what comes next. President Trump's words deserve careful analysis because they were chosen with precision. He said they are in good shape. He said talks have been very productive in the last 24 hours. He said it is very possible that a deal gets done. And then, and this is the part that matters, he said, if we don't get what we have to get, we'll have to go a big step further. That phrase, a big step further. 3 words that carry the full weight of American military capability behind them. The bombing campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities, which was paused, not terminated, remains on the table. The carrier strike group is still positioned. The Super Hornets are still loaded. The targeting packages are still active. Every Iranian military commander, every nuclear scientist, every regime official who has seen the satellite imagery of American force posture in the region understands exactly what a big step further means. And that understanding, that visceral, inescapable awareness of what the alternative looks like, is doing more diplomatic work than any formal proposal ever could, because you do not negotiate seriously unless you believe the other side is willing to walk away from the table and do something that genuinely frightens you. And Iran, for the first time in a very long time, is frightened. But here is where I need to speak directly to the strategic risk, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because any leader worth following must be willing to see the full picture, not just the parts that support the narrative they want to believe. Iran has a history of using negotiations as a delay mechanism. They have done it before, spectacularly, effectively, repeatedly. They engage just enough to reduce pressure, buy time, allow the international coalition arrayed against them to develop fractures, and then reemerge in a stronger position once the political will on the other side has dissipated. Iranian state media is already downplaying the significance of this latest development, already framing the regime's review of the American proposal not as a step toward capitulation, but as a measured response from a sovereign nation that cannot be rushed. That is not a neutral statement. That is a strategic communication designed for a domestic audience, designed to preserve the regime's narrative of defiance, even as it quietly examines terms that represent a historic concession. And that dual track, public defiance, private examination, is a pattern we have seen before. The question every American strategist must be asking right now is this the moment Iran actually breaks from its historical playbook? Or is this the most sophisticated version of that playbook we have ever seen? The answer, and this is the hard truth, is that we cannot know with certainty. Not yet. What we can know is this: the conditions for a genuine breakthrough have never been more precisely constructed. The pressure has never been more comprehensive. The military credibility has never been more recently demonstrated. The domestic instability inside Iran has never been more acute. And the international coalition supporting American objectives has never been more aligned. With Israel striking in the north, American ships blockading in the south, European allies watching anxiously as their own energy security hangs in the balance, and China calculating that its long-term interests may be better served by a stable Middle East under American stewardship, than by a chaotic one defined by Iranian defiance. All of these factors converging simultaneously represents a strategic opportunity that does not come often, perhaps once in a generation. And the decisions made in the next 48 to 72 hours in Washington, in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, on the deck of the Abraham Lincoln will determine whether that opportunity is seized or squandered. And what those decisions reveal about American leadership will echo far beyond the Middle East, because every adversary America faces, from Moscow to Beijing to Pyongyang, is watching this moment with absolute, undivided attention. Because this is what the world needs to understand about American power at its best. It is not simply the power of bombs and carriers and Gatling guns, though those matter, and they matter enormously. It is the power of patience, the power of discipline, the power of building pressure methodically, deliberately over time, of resisting the temptation to act prematurely, of absorbing provocations without overreacting, of maintaining strategic coherence across months and years when the political environment is screaming for quick results and easy wins. That is the hardest thing in leadership, not the moment of action. Any leader can order a strike. Any commander can send in the aircraft. The hardest thing is the discipline of waiting. The hardest thing is holding the line when everything around you is calling for movement, for noise, for visible demonstration of power. The hardest thing is trusting the strategy when the strategy is working, slowly, invisibly, inexorably, and resisting the pressure to abandon it before it has delivered its full effect. I think of the young sailors and aviators aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln right now. I think of the pilot who flew that FA-18 Super Hornet over the Gulf of Oman, who watched an Iranian tanker refuse multiple warnings, who made the decision in seconds under pressure with all the weight of geopolitical consequence riding on that trigger to fire. That pilot trained for years for that moment, every hour in the simulator, every carrier landing in rough seas, every night flight over black water. All of it was preparation for a moment like that. And when it came, they executed with precision, not with aggression, not with recklessness, with precision. That is what American military training produces. That is what American military culture, at its best, looks like in action.